And the next session that actually we will move to without further transition is titled Rights and Voice Setting the Scene. So why this session actually? Before I invite the speakers, who I think are already in the room, I would like to make one quick point. We usually make the point about making sure that we have data that inform policy, data that inform intervention. But how do we translate the findings into programming? First question. We also raise the importance of making sure that young people's rights are protected, promoted. But how do we make sure that this right-based approach is integrated in programming and policy? Well, I will then like to respectfully invite, if they are already here, our speakers, Mr. Stephen Percy and Mrs. Aga Okroche. Please help me to welcome them. So they will first of all sit, and then I will introduce them as I should, and then they will come for the inaugural remarks. So thank you for joining us, Mrs. Aga and Mr. Stephen. This session has basically two specific goals. The first one is to introduce the participant to the right-based approach of the global initiative, and secondly, to present and discuss the finding of a new research titled Aspiration and the Future of Work. As we all know, respecting, promoting, and encouraging human rights is at the core of international cooperation work. More specifically, it is one of the key principles of the global initiative. We also know that young people are facing discrimination. We are seeing our labor rights sometimes discriminated, but we need to work to make sure that these labor rights are protected, that our voices are heard, and that access to jobs are secured and promoted. How can we then build on international human rights standards, including labor rights, to serve young people? How can we make sure that research focusing on youth employment can be translated into policy and programming? That's the reason why today we have two experts. The first one, Mr. Stephen Percy, whose presentation is titled Right-Based Approach Toward Youth Employment, a guiding principle of the Global Initiative on Decent Job and Youth. First of all, let me introduce him. Mr. Percy is an independent economic and social policy consultant, drawing on 40 years of experience. That's extensive. That's extensive. With the ILO, so it's an authoritative and respected voice. He also worked with the International Trade Union Movement as well. So at the ILO, he was serving as a special advisor to the Director General and Deputy Director General and the Director General of the Department for Multilateral Cooperation. I emphasized on the 40 just to make sure that we know that this is a voice. A voice, we are talking about voice, a voice that definitely will share specific insights and guide us through the journey. Respectfully, Mr. Stephen Percy, you have the floor. Please help me to welcome him.
Well, thanks very much indeed. When I started in the labor movement before most of you were born, one of the first things I learned was that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before. So my job this morning is to try to introduce you to the right system that was built by the generations who came before, so that you can use it and build upon it. Have we got the slides up? There we go. So, as Jenny said, I'm sure all of us have heard the argument that Jenny Rustis in the opening session said. I'm sure all of us have heard the argument that any job is better than no job. But I'm equally sure this audience knows all too well that a low-paid, dirty, dangerous, demeaning job can all too easily become a trap from which people never escape. Furthermore, there's plenty of evidence that improving working conditions can go hand in hand with increased productivity. So rights are not a luxury that we have to wait for until economies become rich. As is stated in the UN 2030 agenda, they are both a means to an end and the end itself for sustainable development. And this was recognized from the outset in the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, when the rights-based approach was included in the guiding principles for engagement by partners. I think I'm one step ahead of myself. Decent Jobs for Youth aims to strengthen links between the UN's normative framework and actions by partners. This rights-based approach promotes respect for human rights and the application of international labour standards. And I plan to focus on the international labour standards system and the standards that are especially relevant for young workers and their employers. Then I'll describe a little bit how these standards are applied and how young people themselves, as well as their partners in the initiative, can use standards in programs and projects, as Joni was asking. So, what are the international labour standards? Well, there's a set of principles that countries can use to frame their legislation and policy practice concerning the world of work. These principles aim to establish an environment in which decent jobs are created and work is performed in conditions of freedom, safety, and dignity. So ILO conventions are international treaties which member states of the United Nations are invited to ratify. That means taking these principles, usually very short, 5 or 6 principles each convention, into the national law and practice, and then agreeing to report regularly to the ILO on their application. Now, recommendations, another set of standards, voluntary ones, are usually longer. They supplement the conventions and they provide recommendatory guidance on ways to implement standards. Now, these standards are prepared by representatives from governments, employers' organizations, and unions from all over the world when they meet annually at the International Labour Conference. This year's conference, starting in a couple of weeks' time, will mark the centenary of the ILO. In other words, several generations have been building this, and they were all young ones. The first convention, in 1919, was on the 8-hour day. This year, the aim is to adopt a convention on ending violence and harassment at the workplace. Now, this deliberative and participative process to standard setting ensures that they are authoritative and they command a high degree of consensus worldwide. From the beginning, the idea was that by progressing labour standards together, countries can avoid a race to the bottom in working conditions and rather start a race to the top. In the latest phase of globalization, this is more important than ever. Standards are for all workers in all countries, whether working informally or formally. What we do to make a living is a central part of our identity as a person and as a member of the community. As the ILO founders stated, labor is not a commodity with its price determined solely by the forces of supply and demand in the marketplace, where employers usually have much more bargaining power than individual workers. And furthermore, as the recently launched report of the Global Commission on the Future of Work, sponsored by the ILO, stressed, neither can a person be treated as if they're a robot. So young workers, starting out with little or no experience, often are the last to be hired and the first to be fired. This relatively weak position in the labour market makes it all the more important that their rights are respected. The first years of working life are vital for the development of work skills and self-confidence that are needed to be able to fulfill your capabilities. Correct me if I'm wrong, and perhaps Aga will have some evidence on this. But some of the most important things for young people in work or in seeking work is to be treated with respect and have their voice heard. Rights enable that, especially for those facing discrimination and disadvantage. 8 conventions of the ILO have been identified as fundamental because they are a foundation people need to claim freely and on the basis of equality of opportunity their fair share of the wealth which they have helped to generate and to achieve fully their human potential. That's a quote from the 1998 Declaration. They cover freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Freedom of association is the right of workers to form or join a union of their own choosing, and of employers to similarly form or join an employers' organization. Turning to standards on full, productive, and freely chosen employment. Convention 122 says that governments must aim to ensure that there is work for all who are available for and seeking work. That work is as productive as possible, and that there is freedom of choice and equality of opportunity in employment. Strong growth is clearly needed to assure the creation of sufficient job opportunities for all those seeking work. If you like, that's the demand side of the labour market. But policies are also needed to support workers and employers in enhancing skills and in smoothing the process of job matching, of finding each other, the supply side. A conducive environment for the development of sustainable enterprises, especially micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, is absolutely vital. For young people, the ILO recommends, amongst other things, and other speakers I'm sure will go into more detail on this, youth-oriented vocational guidance and training programs, employment services that meet the particular needs of young people, and community-based programs. A large number of ILO conventions deal with decent conditions of work. An important one is the ever more complex area of defining when a worker is in an employment relationship. And the ILO has a comprehensive recommendation, number 198, on the criteria for determining when work is dependent on an employer. In other words, that there's an employment relationship. Convention 95 ensures the regular and direct payment of wages. Number 131 sets out the processes governments should use for setting minimum wages. Number 100 deals with equal pay for work of equal value. And long-standing conventions cover the 8-hour day and the 48-hour week, as well as weekly rest. A somewhat newer convention, number 175, defines minimum rights for part-time work. And there are several standards that aim to prevent accidents and injury to health at work. A further important area is social protection, because access to social security is a universal human right. And several conventions of the ILO specify how systems should protect all persons from social risks and contingencies over the life cycle by guaranteeing a secure, healthy, and decent standard of living. They cover universal access to healthcare, income security through spells of sickness, unemployment, maternity, disability, and basic income security for children and older workers. So, how are these standards made effective? Well, the first responsibility is with governments and national law courts. However, governments in turn have a responsibility to other members of the ILO to demonstrate that they are living up to these international commitments. So over this last 100 years of ILO, the ILO's existence, its membership has developed a system of supervision of countries' commitments. This is, could take the rest of the morning to describe, but in essence, it involves regular reporting by governments, scrutiny of these reports by experts and by the annual tripartite global conference, dialogue with governments on how to remedy problems and the possibility of unions and employers' organizations, as well as other governments, to bring complaints to the ILO of non-application. In the most serious cases of non-application, and after the government concerned has had a chance to remedy the problem, complaints can lead to the governing body recommending member states to take action against a country. This has actually never reached the final end point. It's been threatened, but it never reached the final end point, which could, in theory, be sanctions. But as well as these international procedures, the ILO has a number of governance standards, labour inspection, labour administration, which assist governments in establishing the national machinery they need to ensure that labour laws are respected. And finally, in many ways, the simplest, cheapest, and most effective way of promoting respect of international labour standards is social dialogue between employers and workers' organisations and governments, if necessary, supported by the ILO. One or two examples of that. The services of employers' organisations can be a big help to small and medium-sized enterprises in ensuring that they understand laws and know how to organise work to ensure they are respected. Similarly, unions can support their local officers, many of whom are volunteers, with representational and dialogue skills. And other civil society organisations and local governments can also be very effective advocates of respect for human rights, especially rights at work. The growth of multinational enterprises and global supply chains, I'm sure we'll hear more about that during the conference, they operate across the national jurisdictions, which are the foundation for this ILO system. And this has led to the development of some new instruments to promote what is often termed corporate social responsibility. The ILO has a multinational enterprises declaration, which includes principles addressing specific aspects of decent work, such as social security, forced labour, transition from the informal to the formal economy, wages, and access of victims or people who are at the wrong end of these of abuses to remedies and compensation. And in parallel to the ILO's own mechanisms promoting respect for standards, many governments use them as points of reference in, for example, trade agreements and in aid programs. So finally, the global initiative is well placed to build on this extensive system of international labour standards in the rights-based approach, which partners have endorsed in the guiding principles for engagement. And these principles aim to facilitate the effective application of standards and norms in commitments and operations on the ground. Now, there are one or two examples from the ILO's experience, including projects in Tanzania and Rwanda, where the social partners in labour and administration and inspection services have worked together to promote awareness of the relevant international labour standards to meeting the challenges young workers face. We heard this morning about the ILO's International Training Centre, supported by our friends here in Italy, in Turin. Well, there's a safe youth at work project. They recently ran a course in Turin for representatives of young workers and ILO constituents on how to improve national occupational safety and health systems so that they can effectively protect young workers. The ILO and the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank have a program called Better Work, been running for several years now, and that's had considerable success in a number of countries in improving working conditions of the predominantly female and young workforce in the garment sector, while at the same time lifting the productivity and profitability of participating enterprises. Let me conclude with just a few ideas on how partners in the initiative could enhance this rights-based approach. First, I think partners could mainstream rights into the design, implementation, and monitoring of commitments that become part of the initiative. How do you mainstream? Well, one of the most practical ways to do this would be to include a training module on rights for participants and the staff who are running a project. And the ILO has got a guide on international labour standards and rights at work for young people, and a toolkit for training facilitators on rights at work for youth. I think Gianni Rosas had a good hand in that a few years ago when it was developed. Third, partners in the initiative will be invited this year to share insights on progress in their actions and the impact of their commitments. Those reports could include steps to mainstream the guiding principles, including the principles on rights. Fourth, finally, and I come back to it again, project participants and employers' organisations and unions should talk to each other. There should be dialogue from the design stage of commitments through to the conclusion and the evaluation. So, thanks very much. I'd be happy to try to respond to questions or comments. And for those of you who have been so inspired that you'd like to dig deeper into the international standard systems, here are a couple of really good publications, at least one of which was available on the table. I think it's already disappeared. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for sharing this very, very capital and key information. Definitely mainstreaming and building on social dialogue are principal avenues in ensuring that the concept of the rights is definitely incorporated. Now we will move to the next speaker, Mrs. Aga Okroj from IUSEC. She is the Global Vice President in charge of public relations for IUSEC. She is responsible for engaging with like-minded organizations, coordinating strategic alliance, publicity efforts for the organization. Her passion is all about communication, but also supporting young people to develop skills and thrive in the future. Her presentation is titled Aspiration and the Future of Work, a survey of the literature and evidence conducted by the ILO and UNU Merit. Please welcome her.
Brilliant. Welcome everyone today. I hope you're having a wonderful day. It's a huge privilege for me to be here with you and share some insights about the study that, as Johnny mentioned, was conducted by ILO and UNU Merit. What matters the most, though, is what this study was about and what was the objective of conducting this in the first place. The study was aiming to first see what young people are aspiring for, to bring up their voices, to collect the data and the evidence about it, but as well to see what is the gap in this aspect. Because there are some things that are lacking, but based on what young people care about, to create the policy recommendations, especially that are aspiration sensitive. But as I said in the beginning, it is a huge privilege for me to be here as well as a responsibility. You can see that there are 1.8 billion young people across the world. Half of the world population is under 30 right now, and this is the largest youth population ever. That has ever been, and maybe that will ever be. And when we talk about youth aspirations, it's not only about the burden and responsibility to create the policies, but I do believe it's a huge opportunity for all of us to create the future of work that is taking this into consideration. Brilliant. So, aspirations. When we talk about aspirations, we are talking about the goals or personal objectives that we have, the beliefs about the things we can achieve in the future, and expectations, what can we do based on what we've been told. And ideally, all of us in our careers should get a chance to fulfill our aspirations. Because we are being shaped by what is our social context, about our life experience, and based on that, we can create what we are aspiring for. Interestingly, the fact if we'll achieve them or not, especially in the labor market, is depending on how realistic they are. And when I'm talking about being realistic, here we talk about changing market conditions. And that's what we should keep in mind while developing youth, or not only youth, I believe everybody deserves to fulfill their aspirations, and to make sure that we are helping them know what is realistic, at the same time maybe us influencing the market conditions while making recommendations. And this is precisely why we wanted to share with you today what is the evidence about youth aspirations, what do they care for, and bring the opportunity for this partnership gathering, because here I was also sharing with the organizers that this is so brilliant that when we talk about creating the future of jobs, we have not only young people in the room talking to young people, or organizations and employers talking to organizations and employers, but we are actually able to have intergenerational dialogue. So let's have a look at the evidence. There are around 18 surveys that are in some dimension covering youth aspirations. Not all of them have clear conceptual framework or are fully covering the youth aspirations, but each of them with different demographics rates or different countries reach, are representing what young people, what is important for them in connection to the labor market and labor outcomes. To start off, before we go towards more career aspirations, let's have a look at what is motivating young people in life in general and what is driving them. What you can see here, young people care the most about family, purpose in life, and love. Interestingly, though, I cannot see the slide, but I remember, the financial aspect is placed in the 4th place after those, which means that it's still very important. Of course, we need to have what to live off, and we need to have things to eat. But what matters the most is those things that are connected to the purpose. What you can see, though, that social status and power and authority are ranked as the last ones. And I think that is very important to keep in mind when we are creating policies or programming for young people. The other aspect I wanted to share with you are the criteria for young people that are crucial for them while choosing a job opportunity. The first one, I think I need to move myself a little bit. I can speak loud. Okay, so the first one Brilliant. Thank you. So the first one is sense of purpose and impact on society, as well as growth and advancement of the career. And this is very, very important to remember when we talk about young people, that they matter, that this matters for them. Of course, if we can see, salary and financial compensations are still crucial, because this hasn't changed. And young people know that they need to have things to live off. When we talk about their concerns, and that is something that was very interesting for me to learn as a young person, first and foremost is lack of experience. Young people are really concerned that lack of experience will influence their career. And I do believe that this is a huge call to action to all of us to make sure that we are creating for young people practical experiences that will not only develop their skills, but will able to, before they go to the formal employment, to get the experience to understand what they will be doing in their future job. At the same time, what we can see, especially in the MENA region, young people are concerned that discrimination by employers will influence as well their career aspiration and their future employment. We can also notice that young people are concerned that there will be not enough jobs or too much competition. And here, what we should keep in mind is that if they are concerned that they will not get a job that they aspire to, they might be afraid of the aspirations failure, and to bear it in mind. One thing that you cannot see in the slide, but was in the review, is that more male than female representatives, young people, were able to say that they don't have any concerns regarding the job. And that's interesting because it might bring us conclusions that females are more concerned about their job opportunities. And it shouldn't be like this. And now I would like to share with you how actually aspirations are matching the labor demand in 3 aspects: in self-employment, in public sector, as well as private sector. When we look at the self-employment, we can see that the reality and the aspirations are quite similar. There's not a big discrepancy, which might tell us that when we talk about necessity to create new jobs, we might need to promote more entrepreneurship and educate young people about entrepreneurship. At the same time, if we look at the differences, especially in Africa, where young people might need to create entrepreneurship, not maybe only because of the fact that they aspire to, but because they need to. This is a call to action for all of us to have more comprehensive approach to create, to invest in job opportunities, both in wage employment as well as sustainable self-employment and entrepreneurship. Now when we look at the public sector and the private sector, there is a difference here. Because there are way more young people who would like to work in the public sector, but they cannot because there is not enough labor demand, while there is way more demand in private sector, but less aspiration or desire of youth to work there. Either we can think how can we create more opportunities for young people to work in a private sector, or Maybe we should invest in informing young people what is actually the situation in the labor market so they don't aspire to work somewhere else in the first place. And the last slide with subtitle is saying aspirations failure. Here you can see the statistics from the analysis that was done in the UK based on what where young people were aspiring to work in, what were their top dreamed 5 jobs, in comparison to where actually they ended up working when they were older. And we can see that young people were aspiring to work in artistic, literary, and media occupation. And this is actually the biggest difference where they failed in working in the end. Or following they were aiming to be health professionals, but again, they didn't manage and their aspirations failed. And going slowly to conclusions, what I wanted to share with you is that young people are having aspirations and we definitely need to support them into being able to be employed where they aspire to. At the same time, there are other learnings that we should take forward during this meeting. First one, we should create opportunities for young people to be supported with mentoring networks or career counseling so they can understand what is happening in the labor market as well, where they can use their strengths and their skills. We need to have a more comprehensive approach to job creation, to have structural investments in both wage employment and sustainable entrepreneurship. And last but not least, the quality of job really matters. Once I remember, to finish off, I had a conversation with a lady who was working in a company in Poland, because I'm from Poland, and we were sharing what young people care for and aspire to. And she told me, this is nothing different than what I aspire to. It's just that you are finally being heard. So maybe this is an opportunity for us all to be heard, to create quality jobs that also enable us to include our health, social life, and dreams into career. Thank you.
I think it's a big honor to hear from these 2 distinguished experts and receive specific insight, especially on the state of the issue, but also most of you have already answered regarding how either the right-based approach, but also the research finding can be mainstream and translated into policy and programming. We may want to come back to that if you have specific insight regarding that, but because the time is very short and we need to get insight from the audience, I would like to come into the audience right now and maybe take a couple of questions, starting first if we have any partners here who want to ask questions. I will start with them and we will take questions from the audience as well. We have 1 microphone being passed around. I thank the support team for that. So because of the time, I will beg your pardon and ask to go straight to the question. Thank you.
Sure, great. Good morning. I'm John True from Plan International, and I'm the Global Lead for Youth Employment and Entrepreneurship. I appreciate the evidence and the insights that were given today, especially around the issues regarding gender and the need to look at inclusion and the various forms of diversity in all its forms. I'm struck by the fact that if the situation was reversed, with having all young people talking about the inclusion of adults into the room, how different this would be, and how we're so excited about the issue of what we're doing to include young people. Mm-hmm. But I think it's no longer the issue of inclusion. It's about operationalizing the institutionalization of young people within all of our work. And how are we creating the opportunities to institutionalize young people's aspirations and views into our work based on physical barriers, but also the entrenched barriers that come with age, ability, disability, gender. So my question really is about not only are we providing the opportunities for young people to be engaged, but how are we really creating the space to institutionalize young people's participation in decent work?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a great question that we need to all address. I will go with the second question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks to the presenters. I am Shahida, came from Bangladesh. I am working in Save the Children Bangladesh country office. I have long experience on youth employment program. Based on my experience, I would like to one comments as well as one questions. My comments from the presentation, which is very informative and aspiring as me also from your presentation. I personally would like to give the emphasis on the central responsibilities on youth employment and the young workers' needs specific policies. From the morning's opening sessions, we got the information from one of the honorable speakers. He said that the youth is considered from 15 to 29 years. So it is a long spectrum from 15 to 29 years. But if we consider the age-specific youth needs, 15 to below 18 years, their needs and constraint is different than the above 18 years old. So you may consider when you develop any revision or any policy formulations, you can consider the age-specific needs and constraint of the young people who are going to be prepared for the decent jobs. This is one. And my question is about I do not find the gender inclusions in the presentations. So it would be nice if you explain a bit more how you do consider the gender inclusions in your program.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. We're taking another one.
Good morning. My name is Rune Brandrup. I work with the UNFPA's regional office based in Istanbul, covering Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And I can say that I'm also glad to hear how the population issues have already been brought up. We have a young population around the world, and the demographic dividend is a crucial time to invest in young people and see them as potentials, not as problems, as was also mentioned. So, but also we should make sure that we see young people first and foremost as people with their rights, and we need to fulfill their rights before we see them as instruments in achieving certain economic goals. So that's the approach that we have as UNFPA. And one of the things that we look at is trying to look at young people as integral human being with multiple needs and aspirations. And not just look at them as somebody who is looking for a job, but also somebody who has other aspirations and needs in this world. So from this perspective, we often try to integrate what is our, let's say, core mandate on sexual reproductive health and rights into labor market programs and how to link that for young people to enter opportunities both in education and for empowerment and for employment. What we see is that young people who may have HIV may have very many difficulties in realizing their aspiration in the labor market. They might face stigma and discrimination, which is a huge issue for them. And also we see that young women who might become pregnant when they are not planned to, or are not able to plan their families and have good and healthy relationship, might live in relationships of violence, also have a lot of difficulties also in the labor market. So looking at young people and realizing those rights is very important also when we talk about decent job and when we talk about employment opportunities in general. It's about making sure that they have the opportunities that they need. So in this whole it's in this whole environment of looking at young people in their entirety, and especially thinking about also all of those young people who are left behind. How do we make sure that we are doing enough to make these opportunities also available for those who are often left behind? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment and the question. Maybe we can take one more very quick because of the time running. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Desmond Alugunwa. I'm with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. Thank you so much for the presentations, and I really like the research findings. The UN Major Group for Children and Youth, we are the official platform through which young people contribute to sustainable development processes. And we speak about universality and equity of access with passion. Talking about how to balance aspirations of young people. How do we make sure that the child in the village, in the rural area, who is dreaming to save the world, his aspiration is met as compared to the one who is also dreaming to rule the world? Because we have so many interventions that remain at the word stage and do not translate into action. So we're looking at the process where we are able to really transition from individual aspirations to societal aspirations where everyone is really inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really good one. So this is the first round. We'll go to the speakers, and I will kind of try to summarize because a couple of questions are very similar. The last questions, the two last questions were most about how can we make sure that we don't leave no one behind. That's the first one for both of you. The second one is about how do we operationalize and institutionalize youth aspiration and youth participation. That's the second question. And the third one was a clarification regarding the gender inclusion, more a comment, clarification type. So I will hand it over to you speakers, bearing in mind that the break is running and the time is running as well. Distinguished speaker, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for the questions. I actually saw a very big alignment between all of them. What I saw is more, how do we institutionalize including young people, taking into consideration gender aspect, all the demographics, and making sure that no one is left behind. So that's why I would try to answer in a simple way. Include young people insights in the decision-making process that is database, information-based, and take those aspects into consideration. Do see through the gender aspect, do see where young people come from, what are their privileges maybe they have in life, or what kind of social background they come, or financial background they come, and keep it in mind while creating the programs and creating the recommendations. I do believe that including young people in the decision-making process is one step. Then what should happen as well is including them in the implementation of the programming. Sometimes or policies, there are brilliant ideas, but implementation is not feasible to get there. And when you only include them in the decision-making process, but not in implementation, I do believe some resources might be allocated not in the most effective or efficient way. And last thing is also see how can you, after the things are done, make also review or feedback process so that we can keep learning, because the world keeps going on, so we need to keep learning and improving.
Just a couple of quick points. I think the ILO Director General Guy Ryder emphasized that the number of women young women who are not in employment or education or training is much higher than men. But there's another little fact that I think we have to wrestle with. This huge youth generation, the biggest ever, is the most educated ever, and female education is actually running higher than male. So girls are leaving the education system on average with at least as good, if not a little better, educational attainment than the boys. What happens? What happens next? Why are women less able to progress in the labour market? Well, number one is many women take unfair responsibilities for care work, often unpaid, looking after elders, and eventually looking after children. That's a blockage to getting into the labour market. Amongst the ILO standards, there's one on workers with family responsibilities, which I think is a rather important one. Secondly, many women face discrimination at work. There's a clear pay gap, but that pay gap really opens up not in the 20s. It really becomes pronounced in the 30s, and women after the age of after the 30s never really catch up. What happens to women in the age range of the 30s? Well, many have children. And unfair responsibilities in bringing up children is another big part of the problem. So we need to invest in early childcare, which incidentally is tremendously important for the skills that we need in the labour market these days. The skills that are demanded in the new sectors, the higher tech sectors, are actually social skills which are built in age 2 to 3. So you've got to start really early. So childcare is important to combat gender discrimination in work, and it's very important for building the future. Finally, there's violence and harassment at work, and I think you may remember that this year the effort is on at the conference, the centenary conference, to introduce a standard on violence and harassment at work. It doesn't say gender violence and harassment at work, but clearly one of the groups that is most important there is women. The colleague from Bangladesh raised these questions, and the garment sector, which you know very, very well, is a predominantly female sector. And the Better Work program, which I think is a really exciting program, recently introduced in Bangladesh, is having really important effects on the lives of women workers. Simple things in terms of hygiene at work is really important, but also transport to work. There's a whole lot of things that can be done in very practical ways, some of which are envisaged in conventions, but many of which follow through in the programs, the projects, the sorts of things that this global initiative can sponsor to make these rights operational in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this is definitely a good way to close this panel. Definitely we need to realize that right is not a luxury. Labor is not a commodity that needs to be defined by one single party. Social dialogue and mainstreaming of the right approach is key. Leaving no one behind, addressing gaps and unpaid work should be included in our intervention. But also importantly, the key research finding that has been shared today are giving specific insight to tailor our intervention, but also are part of the learning process of the global initiative.